at Arizona State University and has a variety of research interests that center on volcanology and magmatism at many levels within the Earth. And he has also served as a program officer at NSF, right across the hall from our Russ Kells, in instrumentation and facilities, but now he's back at UNM and has some interests in geodetic monitoring of volcanoes, as well as possible future interests in geodetic monitoring of volcanoes. But he's come to give us a talk on the Deep Carbon Degassing Observatory. And so please join me in welcoming Toby.
Thank you very much, Megan, for inviting me. And yeah, it's good to be here. This is a picture of Old Doño volcano in East Africa. I'm not going to be talking about that today. So I will talk about the Deep Carbon Degassing Initiative and the Deep Carbon Observatory and some efforts that we're trying to establish for monitoring or better understanding and monitoring deep carbon degassing. So that is carbonatite. Yes. Okay, advance the slide. Usually I do this. Do I have to do this? What did you do? This? Okay. Okay, that's what I did. Okay. Slow. Oh, can we dim the lights or something? Maybe? In early Earth, the carbon cycle was really dominated by exchange of metal silicate and metal and silicate carbon exchange in the mantle, and degassing and ingassing, so carbon exchange with the atmosphere and the mantle. Whereas in the current Earth, the carbon cycle is really dominated and controlled by subduction of carbon. So subduction of carbon, carbon ingassing, and then carbon outgassing from the mantle to the atmosphere, into the atmosphere and into the ocean. So that's what's really happening with the deep carbon cycle right now. So it has changed over time. So when we want to monitor or understand the carbon cycle, a really important part is to figure out the sources of the carbon, okay? And one powerful tracer to do that is to use helium isotopes. And helium is very powerful because it tells us, do we have a pointer? It tells us something about the source of the volatiles. The deep mantle has very characteristic helium isotope signature that is, higher than 8 times the air value. So ocean island basalts, they have high helium-3,4 ratios. More upper mantle has helium-3,4 ratios that are about 8 times the air value. Crustal rocks are very low in helium-3,4 ratios because they have a lot of radiogenic helium-4 in them. Volcanic arcs are between 8 and 5, and that's because the volatiles that come out of volcanoes sample predominantly mantle-derived volatiles. So that's an important part on the helium that you might want to keep in mind. But what comes out of volcanoes is not just helium, obviously. Helium is a minor gas. The major gas is water. 95% of the gases that come out of any arc volcano and even hotspot volcanoes is water, followed by CO2, sulfur species, some nitrogen, helium, again in minor concentrations, maybe some methane, carbon monoxide. So we can measure all these stable isotopes and the noble gas isotopes, but there are also a lot of trace elements that come out of these volcanoes all the time. So the magmas that are supplying these volatiles are degassing everything pretty much they have in them and continuously degassing those things. Another important thing to remember is that the volatiles that come out of these volcanoes have different solubilities in magma. You're probably already familiar with that. But important for this talk is that CO2, carbon dioxide, has a very low solubility people look at little bits of melt that are trapped in crystals, we call these melt inclusions, we often see these degassing trends. So we have samples, for example, from Etna that have 3,000 ppm CO2 in them and 3 weight percent water. And then in the same eruption, you can find some samples that have very low CO2, less than 100 ppm, and pretty low water content. But what always happens, or mostly happens, is that you have these trends of degassing, open system degassing. And that shows that the CO2 degasses first, the water remains kind of stable in the melt for a while, and then it degasses. So as the melt moves up, pressure is lowered, CO2 comes out first, water, sulfur comes out later. And this is a very powerful way of actually understanding how magma moves around. You're able to monitor some of these components. Now, when we look at subduction zones, which are an important part of the carbon cycle, this is for centuries. Subducted carbon in seafloor sediments and altered oceanic crust goes down. At some point, pressure temperatures become high enough to release those volatiles. And the CO2, water, nitrogen, sulfur, all of these elements that are stored in the oceanic crust somewhere come out through volcanoes, and they mix with mantle volatiles. The CO2 content of the mantle is very low, right? So less than 300 ppm, 200, 300 ppm. But the mantle is so huge that the amount of carbon that's stored in the mantle is bigger than the entire amount of carbon that's stored on the Earth's surface. So the mantle is a really huge reservoir for carbon. And that's part of what the Deep Carbon Observatory is trying to understand, the exchanges of carbon between the mantle and the surface. So Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Honduras, El Salvador are great places to study the carbon cycle because we have a well-defined subduction zone. We have tight spacing of volcanoes that are active and accessible. The subducted lithology, the sediment lithology, has been very well constrained, and this is just a general diagram. Shows that we have these hemipelagic diatom-rich muds subducting and these pelagic carbonates that are underlying these diatom-rich muds. And importantly, along the strike of the subduction zone, there is no change in the lithology that goes down into the subduction zone. So we know what goes down into the subduction zone, and the question is, what comes out of volcanoes? So we can sample volcanoes like this one. This is Poas volcano, 2008. Here's in Costa Rica. Here's the crater. Maybe some of you have been there. But this is on a nice day, you can see that this is the crater rim. And here's the inner crater. This is a crater lake here. There's a dome that's degassing. And this is a lake that has a pH at this time of about 2. When you go down to the lake, it looks like this. Here's the lake. And here are these fumaroles degassing from the dome. So very intense degassing. And since about 2007, 2008, the lake level has been going down, further and further, exposing these dome fumaroles. And here's some people sampling these fumaroles. I think that's myself and some other guy sampling this back in 2008. The lake in 2008 looked like this, kind of milky, white. And here are the dome fumaroles that are exposed. And so you can sample quite easily. I was just back there last week, and it looks like this now. The lake is here, very hard to see because there's so much gas coming off the lake. And in fact, it's sulfur dioxide coming off the crater lake. So it's so saturated in magmatic volatiles that the water can't hold them anymore and just comes out into the atmosphere. So we measure SO2 degassing from the lake. The fumaroles are here in the background, and the lake pH is 0 now. In fact, measured negative pH, which is, I don't understand how that can even be, but that's what they measured. And so it's certainly the most acid natural body of water in the world right now. Temperature is 45 degrees, so it's pretty nasty stuff. You can sample the gases, something like this, put a titanium tube in there, and then you can connect some bottles to it and sample it and take it back to the lab and do all these analyses. So when we look at volcanic arcs, and just looking at the helium isotopes here again, so this is against the air value, which is by definition just 1. Okay, so air would just be here, and this is carbon isotopes. So carbon isotopic composition of CO2. Take the carbon from the CO2, measure its isotopic composition, and plot it against helium. We see a big scatter of helium as well as carbon, and the more helium range is up here, the arc's global average is here, but we see that there are some lower values. So clearly there's some crustal helium and crustal carbon most likely contributing to some of these emissions. So this plot is pretty useful, but there is a much more useful plot that people came up with early on in the study of CO2 from volcanoes, and that's to combine the CO2 with the helium. So you just make a ratio of CO2 helium-3, and then you plot that against carbon isotopes. And now you have these nice 3 end members. That's like a geochemist dream. You spread out the whole diagram, and you have these end members, and then you can plot things inside of these end members to figure out the sources. And you can then calculate mixing relationships. So limestone, this would be subducted carbonate. This would be subducted oceanic sediment. Mid-ocean ridge basalts, upper mantle, carbon isotopic composition of -5 or so. Very low CO2 helium ratios. As you add limestone in, CO2 will go up. Helium is from the mantle, so it's not going to go up, so the ratio is going to go up. So this is quite a useful way of looking at carbon sources. It has been used a lot. And when you plot the data, I compiled a bunch of data from all the samples that are available. Looks something like this, right? So yes, they plot generally in that field, and you could calculate for each of these samples the relative contribution of mantle and subducted carbon in order to figure out how much of the carbon is coming from the subducted sediments or from the subducted slab. In other words, how much is recycled into the mantle and comes back out through the volcanoes. And that's what the modern deep carbon budget is about, right? We want to figure out how much of the carbon goes back to the surface through volcanoes. And the situation works pretty well. So this is Central America. And in general, you see that, yes, the CO2 coming out of volcanoes in Central America has more of a carbonate contribution to it than, for example, in Japan, where we have more of a organic sediment contribution. So what is subducted seems to be reflected pretty well in what comes out of the volcanoes, at least in general. Now, in the same country, Costa Rica, you can go behind the volcanoes. And this is a view from behind the volcanic arc to Poas volcano. And when we were there a few years ago, we discovered these CO2 vents. Well, we didn't discover these CO2 vents. Farmers were drilling for water, and what they would find was pure CO2 coming out of the ground. Right? So they would drill a well, look for water, and no water, just CO2 coming out. And we sampled this together with some collaborators. Just sample the dry CO2. You can't see anything, but it's just pouring out of here. And just connect the tube and sample it in a bottle. And the data is not published, but it's 99% CO2 or more. So it's almost pure CO2 that comes out of the ground at low temperatures. And we've seen similar things in East Africa. No volcanic connection. This is clearly not in a volcanic crater, but it's just a hole in the ground. When you do the helium isotopes on this, well, it plots right here, very mantle-like, okay, very similar to some of the most magmatic or mantle-type volatiles that we sample in a volcanic front. You plot it on this diagram, again, very typical for Central America, just in that field of more mantle, which is here, mixed with carbonates. Right? So these are clearly based on this mantle volatiles that come out behind a volcanic front. So the picture gets more complicated, right? Now we have something like this, where we have subduction of volatiles, CO2 and water and so on. Volatile release, some of them go through the arc, like POAS. Some of it comes out in the back arc, like what I showed. We can go to so behind the volcanic front, we can go to the back arc in Honduras, where we also see mantle-derived CO2. And most recently, we've been looking in the forearc, which is represented by the Nicoya Peninsula and the Osa Peninsula, which are really forearc regions. And there we also find groundwaters that are full of CO2. And we're trying to figure out how much of that CO2 is just crustal, or is there perhaps some mantle or slab-derived contribution as well, some early on degassing of CO2 in the subduction process. Now, another CO2 degassing path is simply through the soil. And this is really work that Giovanni Chiodini has pioneered in the early 90s, where they walk around with CO2 flux meters and measure the flux of CO2 coming out of volcanoes. And so here is, this is Campi Flegrei in Italy, and the red areas are high CO2 flux, okay? And these are the black points are the measuring points. And you see that there's high CO2 flux in the caldera, but also along these faults, and in some places where you see no surface features at all. The carbon isotopes of these areas show mantle-type values where you have the high CO2 flux. So again, we have mantle-derived CO2 coming out of the soil in Italy, and other studies are underway elsewhere. And this is not an insignificant amount. So here are fumaroles, and you can clearly see that these areas are extremely affected by that CO2 flux. There's no vegetation. And when you calculate the total flux, you come up with about 1,430 tons of CO2 degassing per day, right? So 1,400 tons a day, that number probably doesn't mean anything to you, but it's like a regular volcano, right? That's not erupting, but just simply like puffing along, degassing, doing its thing. So this is very similar kind of order of magnitude to that. So volcanic gas geochemists use a lot of different techniques, right? We look at melting inclusions to get CO2. We look at diffuse soil degassing with a variety of techniques. We use direct sampling to collect samples taken back to the lab. We make flux measurements in the volcanic plume. We collect samples in the plume, make measurements in the plume, and we use satellites, all to kind of understand what are the volatiles coming out of volcanoes. And it's quite challenging and quite different, for example, compared to the geophysical seismological community that essentially has one instrument, and the instrument really hasn't changed that much since 1990. And then one kind of data is obtained generally. You get amplitude versus time. And with that instrument, you can do a lot of stuff, as you know, right? You have one seismometer, you can make some interesting measurements. You have two seismometers, you can make more interesting measurements. But if you have a network of seismometers, you can make some amazing measurements, and you can manipulate the data, and you can get some really interesting information about the Earth that you may not have even thought about when you put one instrument down on a volcano, for example. So you can see earthquakes traveling, waves traveling around the world several times after a big earthquake. You can, of course, do seismic tomography and see very detailed where the slab is, where the crust is, and where volatiles or melts migrate up from the slab to the surface. So there's a lot of information that you can gain from relatively straightforward measurements compared to the volcanic gas geochemistry, where we have so many different types of techniques. So deep carbon degassing, the DECADE initiative, is the first global attempt, the first initiative globally to really monitor volcanic carbon flux, right? And it was conceived at the IAFSE Commission Chemistry of Volcanic Gases 12th field workshop in Kamchatka. So this commission has been around for a long time. It's a YASE subcommission. And we meet every 3 years to go to some place and collect samples and make measurements. And at that time, some people from the Deep Carbon Observatory were participating, and we started to think about what can we do to improve our knowledge of carbon emissions from the Earth. So the Deep Carbon Decade Initiative is basically 4 parts. One is the Volcano network, and I'll talk about this a little bit. This is the NOVAC network, which is the network for observation of volcanic and atmospheric change, and that's run out of Chalmers University in Sweden. Then some installation of CO2 SO2 monitoring instruments. So if you know the CO2 SO2 flux and you have the ratio, you can calculate the CO2 flux. We have some initial or individual plume and sampling campaigns, and we do some soil degassing as well as melt inclusion. And all that data comes together in a database that we're developing together with the Smithsonian and with EarthChem to include volcanic gas data into the database and allow them to be linked together with other data like volcanic explosivity index, activity of the volcanoes, rock composition, deformation, whatever people want to do. So the database part is well underway. The Smithsonian is developing a volcanic flux database, so that's where the SO2 fluxes go in, or CO2 fluxes go in, and the CO2 SO2 ratios, they go into that database. At UNM, we work with EarthChem to expand EarthChem to include some direct gas samples. So there's gas sample data back from the 1950s up to now, and none of it is captured in any kind of database. Okay, so if you want to know something, you have to find the original papers and so on. So we're populating that database. And then the group in Palermo is putting together a soil flux database as well as some direct gas sampling part to that database. And that was funded with some initial $100,000 from the Deep Carbon Observatory. And it's still, we're still working on it, obviously. It's not completed yet. So why do we want more data? Well, this is probably not an audience to try to convince of that. But one thing we want to understand is, volcanoes, when are they going to erupt, right? And how are they going to erupt? So here is POAS again. You're familiar with it now. And here's the dome. And this was in 2009, phreatic eruption, like that. So a lot of steam and some solid material, which is it's not a lot of juvenile material, but there's mostly some lake sediments that are being blown out through the crater. And these kinds of eruptions really started in 2006, late 2006, 2007. Not all of them are this big. This is one of the biggest. But when we were there just last week, there are little small eruptions happening in the lake. As we were there, we saw 6 of those very, very small eruptions. They didn't make it very big, but you wonder when you're standing next to the lake, well, is this going to go big, or is it just going to die down? And it died down every time, right? But we need more data in order to understand what is going on. This is a very big tourist attraction. People go up there and look at it and so on. And if you're sampling it, you want to know if it's safe or not. So we have some data. This is very early work by Sue Brantley and others from 1980. This is the CS ratio, CO2 sulfur ratio, or carbon sulfur ratio. And it's very stable. We don't have any data here, but we think it's pretty stable. And then we have this big spike in carbon sulfur ratio in 2000 or late 2000, and it drops again. And that's when we really started working on this. We have a lot of samples here. But remember, if there's a high CS ratio, that means a lot of CO2, little sulfur, we think that possibly during this time there was an injection of new magma into the system, and that's really what was triggering or starting the eruptions that we finally see back in, now in 2005, 2006, up to the present. Since then, not much has happened, remained pretty stable. This plot here shows some other ratio that shows us more of a hydrothermal magmatic interchange that I'll be talking about a little bit later. Now, Stromboli, where they have a lot of monitoring because there's a lot of people living very close, is very, very tightly observed. And when you talk to the Italians, they will tell you that the gas emissions are a really good early warning system for that particular volcano as well as for Etna. So they're very advanced in what they monitor in terms of gas emissions. And this plot, I think, is quite convincing of that. Here is Stromboli. This is from Ayupa's paper 2011, and here we have data from 2006, 2007. CO2-SO2 ratio, again, the time average quiescent plume is like this, 7 or something. That's the average ratio, and here are all the data points. And then you have the spike in CS ratio, or CO2-SO2 ratio, right before the eruption, major explosion, 15th of December in 2006, and it was preceded by the spike in CS ratio. Again, they say that this is related to injection of undegassed CO2-rich magma from depth that then triggers these explosions. After the explosion, the gas is released, things go back down, and then things get quite sporadic, and more explosions happen afterwards, and continue on, normal Strombolian activity. So this slide is that there's a lot more data points than in that previous slide that I showed you, and that's because these are not direct samples. There's nobody, going there to collect a sample. Obviously, you can't do it, but they are monitoring it with instrumentation. So here's Kilauea, and you might be familiar with this paper, Poland's Nature Geoscience paper, 2012. And from 2003 to 2007, they've seen a lot of an increase in magma supply. And for deformation, it's quite interesting because there are all these GPS points here where they measure the deformation. And the CO2 emissions have really increased at Kilauea before the eruptive sequence. So when you look at it, this here is deformation, the distance between these 2 points, which are across the Halimaumau caldera, and the CO2 is shown here. So the long-term background of CO2, 7,000 tons a day. Okay, so Campi Flegrei, remember that was about 1,400. So this is 7,000 tons a day. That's a lot of CO2 for the background just coming out of Kilauea on a regular Sunday afternoon. And here's deformation pretty flat. And then in mid-2004, they started to see high CO2 concentrations. It really went up, and they started increasing their monitoring program. So we don't have data here, but what we see is that in mid-2005, the CO2 flux went up to about 20,000 tons a day. So from 7 to 20,000, that's a significant increase, factor of 3. And deformation was creeping up as well. But the deformation is lagging behind. You see, the deformation went up a little bit, but the CO2 is maxed out here already. And then the deformation continues to go up. CO2 already goes down. And then the eruption happened right here, okay? And then the CO2 it spikes here, but then it goes back down. Deformation is highest here, and then the caldera kind of collapses a little bit, and deformation goes back down. So what this means is that, based on their paper, the CO2 is from really, really deep. Okay, they speculate, or they think that it's from about 80 kilometers deep. And the magma is moving up. And so what's happening is that at these great depths, the CO2 is exsolving from the magma, is making it up to the surface, out of the caldera, before the magma can deform anything on the surface. So the CO2 is an extremely early warning signal for that type of Now, you cannot see the CO2. Here is 20,000 tons a day of CO2. Looks like nothing. And the plume here is essentially pure CO2. So only the CO2 is coming out of the volcano. SO2 and H2O is not coming out. It's still dissolved in that magma. And only later on, 2013, you see the plume now. SO2, H2O is coming out. It's a visible plume. And you're down to 5,000 tons a day of CO2. So monitoring CO2 is quite important. It's a very, very good indicator of volcanic activity. It's an early indicator of what is happening in terms of the activity. And it also is a scientific question. What is going on? So we started installing these monitors in a few places. Here's a little, it's an upside down syringe, an open syringe, pumps the gas in through a filter, and then analyzes it, and the signal gets sent by line of sight to the crater rim and then to the observatory. Here's some early data. This station was installed in February 2014, and we see, this is CO2 SO2. We see that there's quite some variation of the CO2 SO2 ratio. And there's these eruptions going on, these phreatic eruptions. They are very small, but we see that there's variation on a short time scale of CO2 SO2. H2S SO2 ratios also vary. And again, this is just very preliminary data that my former student just sent me a few days ago. Another volcano that's monitored is Turrialba volcano, also in Costa Rica, with the same instrument. And again, we see spikes in CO2 SO2 ratios, factor of 2 or 3. And this has probably to do with the gas sniffer detecting different fumaroles, high temperature versus low temperature fumaroles, and so on. But we see a lot of variation that previously we were not able to see at all because, sample was just collected once a year or something like that. So we get information about magma movement from the gases. The other information we get is compositionally. Is the gas magmatic or is it hydrothermal? And this is a very old plot that shows that. It's been known for a long time. And this axis here is CO2 in millimoles per mole dry gas. So these are direct samples. Here's total sulfur and here's total chlorine. So at magmatic conditions, the CO2 concentrations are relatively low, and you have high HCl concentrations. Okay, so HCl is high, and sulfur, which are these points here, is also quite low. Okay, so a magmatic gas has low CO2, relatively low sulfur, and a lot of chlorine. And the sulfur that's in there is mostly SO2. A hydrothermal gas is different. It has a lot of CO2, and it has low chlorine because the chlorine that comes from the magma reacts with water, like similar to the crater lake, gets absorbed by the water, and you don't see it coming out through the vents. And the sulfur goes up because the chlorine goes down, and you see the sulfur being more H2S and less SO2. So from a geochemist perspective, volcano looks like this. You have magma with all these volatiles, and if you have direct degassing, you get these species. But if you have an aquifer that interacts with the volatiles, you're going to get compositions that are different, that are water-rich, CO2-rich, H2S-rich, have methane in them, and so on. So compositionally, the gases change depending on whether the magma is degassing directly or whether you have some interaction with a hydrothermal aquifer. Now, we can apply this to understand what is going on at a volcano. So here's Santorini, which is quite famous. And since about 2011, people have noticed an increase in the seismicity. Okay, hundreds of shallow earthquakes have occurred there at about 1 to 6 kilometers depth. So these earthquakes were detected in 2011, and as part of the Decade Initiative, my colleague Alessandro Ayupa installed a multi-gas sensor on Santorini to see what is the gas doing. And it's collecting samples every few, 2 to 3 measurement cycles per day. So every few hours, it collects a sample. And so we get essentially real-time data from that volcano. And what you get are these kinds of plots. So water, CO2, SO2, H2S, individual measurements, and then you can fit a line through them, and you can get ratios of CO2 to water or CO2 to sulfur and so on. And you get time variations. So Santorini is interesting because it has very carbon-rich gases. So the water-CO2 ratio is 1 to 6, which is very high, very low, sorry. And it's very sulfur-poor, and it's redox buffered by hydrothermal reactions. So the water-hydrogen ratio puts it right here, which is typical for hydrothermal gases, very different from like Ertaale or Goreli or Erebus, which are much more reduced, typical magmatic types of gases. When you plot it on this triangular diagram, CO2, water, total sulfur, the Santorini gases plot here, which are very CO2 rich, right? Very different from arc volcanoes that are typically more water rich because they get all this subducted seawater. So the composition is more similar to what you would expect within plate and rift volcanoes. So that's one important finding. The other thing is that the composition has changed. So June 2012 to October 2012, CO2 H2S ratio went from magmatic to more hydrothermal. And water CO2 ratio, again, went from more magmatic perhaps to more hydrothermal over time. So the system, even though it had this huge amount, these earthquakes before 2012, by 2012, we don't see any big amount of CO2 or high CO2 sulfur ratios coming out of the volcano. So the interpretation is that deformation happened in 2011, January 2011 to April 2012, and that led to a significant uplift of the caldera, 8 to 14 centimeters, and about 10 to 20 million cubic meters of magma are thought to have been emplaced underneath that caldera. But by the time we installed the instruments, we did not see any significant magmatic input anymore. The system has gone back to hydrothermal. At least that's what it looks like. So that implies that the CO2 is degassed, and do we need to expect an eruption or not? Well, we don't know, but it's a good idea to keep monitoring it and seeing what is the gas composition doing, what is the deformation doing, is there going to be another deformation event, and is that accompanied with another spike of CO2 sulfur ratio? So we can use the gas data to interpret the deformation, I think, similar to what we have been able to do at Kilauea, or what the USGS has been able to do at Kilauea. Yeah, so that's what I just said. So now some things about how do we actually measure emissions. Emissions from volcanoes have been measured really since the 1970s, early 1970s, with this big instrument, the COSPEC. Oops. That's the wrong thing. Yeah. What do I do? I don't want it. So it'll just go away, right? Yeah. So here's the COSPEC, which is a 70-pound instrument. You have a big charge recorder and car batteries, big tripod to monitor the SO2 coming out of volcanoes. It works by absorption of ultraviolet light. You can use it in many different ways, but here it's scanning through the plume, and you get a signal of sulfur SO2 absorption by the SO2 in the plume. And if you know the wind speed, you can calculate a flux. So the wind speed goes in a factor of 1, right? And you get meters per second or tons per day. So you need to know the plume speed. Now we have very small instruments since about 2005 or 2004. We have these very small USB spectrometers that are run off a laptop computer. You don't need a big tripod. You don't need a big battery. Everything runs off the computer, and you can make a lot more measurements. This is Oldonyelengai erupting in 2006 explosive eruption. And so this technology has led to an explosion of SO2 flux data from volcanoes. Every observatory has one now. They're very cheap, $5,000, as opposed to the COSPEC, which was about $70,000. Now, plume modeling is a really important part, I think, that we're trying to get into. This is from the Los Alamos high-grad modeling of the Los Alamos National Lab Group. Here's Kilauea plume, and here's a model of the gas coming out of Kilauea, and the inputs are, the temperature here, and then some meteorologic data, and the model can calculate how much gas is actually coming out and where's the gas going. So with more sophisticated models like that, we can improve our basically plume speed determinations and more accurate gas emission data. Fluxes from different arcs have been compiled, by a number of different workers, and you can split it up into arcs, and you get a total sulfur dioxide flux moles per year. If you then combine that with CO2 SO2 ratios, so you might wonder, why don't we measure as CO2 directly? Well, it's very difficult to measure because the atmospheric background is so high, right? So what we measure is SO2, and then use a ratio to calculate CO2. And then if you have some information about what goes down into the subduction zone, you can kind of get a general idea of the recycling efficiency of different arcs. Okay, I'm not going to go into that too much. So, but not only the CO2 comes out through the volcanoes, but it comes out everywhere. And in most of these calculations, that has not been taken into account. Global CO2 flux estimates vary by an order of magnitude. This is a recent number by Burton et al., 2013, 540 megatons per year. And earlier data by Patrick Allard, 66 megatons per year. And here are many different methods that people have used. There's an even higher measurement or higher estimate that just came out that's close to, I think, 800 megatons per year. Again, compared to anthropogenic, this is quite small. It's about 1% of anthropogenic CO2 that we are releasing by burning fossil fuels. But for example, for Costa Rica, because Costa Rica has a lot of CO2-rich degassing volcanoes, it's about 10% of the country's CO2 emissions. And Costa Rica is trying to lower its CO2 emissions. It's trying to become carbon neutral by 2025. I don't think they're going to count the volcanoes in that, because that wouldn't really be fair. But maybe one day the volcanoes will be 100% of the CO2 emissions of Costa Rica. Now, just briefly about the network, and this network is quite impressive, I think, because 25 of about 150 or 200 actively degassing volcanoes are monitored by this NOVAC network that was really started by Bo Gale in the mid-90s or so. And they installed all these stations at volcanoes that are accessible, that are observable by observatories, and that are logistically possible. And so a lot of them are in Central and South America, but there's Nyiragongo, Nyamuragira, which are huge volcanic degassers, Mayon in the Philippines, and of course Volcano, Etna, Eyjafjallajökull in Iceland, and so on. These data are coming in continuously, and the stations look something like this. You have solar panels, you have these spectrometers that are pointing towards the plume. Usually they have 3 spectrometers arranged around the volcano so that they capture the plume most of the time. Now, when the wind changes, some of them might not capture the plume, and so there's a lot of issues that have to be dealt with. The data flow is something like this. Usually 3 instruments go directly to the observatory, to the internet, can be accessed by the user, and then are stored on servers at Chalmers University in Sweden. Now, this is the number of measurements, and this is not up to date. This is, I think, ends at 2011, but there have been, to that point, about 2.1 million measurements of SO2 emissions from volcanoes, which, of course, is a huge amount compared to what we had before, when individual people just go and make a measurement, or when observatories make a measurement. And here's just one example of Vado del Ruiz in Colombia. And we see that, over a few months, there's a lot of measurements and perhaps some variation, but there's also big error bars. And these things still have to be sorted out. There still needs to be a lot of cleaning up of the data, manipulation, and figuring out what the wind speed was, and so on, to get very nice data sets for all of these volcanoes. So the Deep Carbon Observatory Reservoirs and Fluxes Directorate is charged with understanding the exchange of carbon from the mantle to the surface. There are 4 directorates in the Deep Carbon Observatory, and Reservoirs and Fluxes is one of them. The others are Deep Energy, Deep Life, and Extreme Physics that deal with carbon in the mantle and how carbon can support life and so on. It's organized like this, and we've been doing this for about a year or year and a half. We have members. We have a board of directors, 6 members that are elected. We have a coordinating committee, and then we have these subcommittees that are dealing with network observatories, instrument development, database, and flux sampling. And we have chair people that are chairing these committees. We have connection to a number of entities that are relevant to our field. And so far, we have some additional focus volcanoes, so Turrialba in Costa Rica, Goreli, Kamchatka, Galeras, San Cristobal, Nicaragua. And we collaborate with observatories, Kilauea, Piton de la Fournaise, Japanese and Italian volcanoes, White Island, Porras, Costa Rica, to get additional data into our Cape network. Future volcanoes, Nyiragongo, Popocatépetl, and others, obviously that is limited by funding and by logistics. It's very hard to work at Nyiragongo in the Congo. It's very hard to climb Popocatépetl and have a station installed at 5,500 meters height. Then multi-gas stations that measure CO2, SO2 continuously are installed in several places permanently, and that has been ongoing by the Italian Volcanological Survey and the Japanese Geological Society. So in Italy, Piton de la Fournaise, Nakajima. And the new ones are Kilauea, Masaya, Turrialba, Poas, and also Goreli in Kamchatka, where we have multi-gas stations installed and where we get continuous data right now. I think the Kamchatka station is not quite there yet. Previous work was Santorini that I talked about, but also Lascar, Lasteria. And we had this mini grant kind of proposal system where we gave individual PIs some money to target particular volcanoes for measuring. So Kilauea, Vanuatu Arc, Merapi, Azores, and Copahue are currently being sampled and measured through individual campaigns. Instrument development. As you can see, instrumentation is really an important part of this. So we're always trying to get new instruments going and help people develop new instrumentation to improve our measurements. And as I said, we had this mini grant thing where we had PIs just submit a proposal to a committee, and then we had these proposals evaluated by various subcommittees, and then the board of directors made some recommendations. Now, what's really important is that DCO and DECADES are not really funding agencies. It's not like NSF, but it's more like helping PIs to get going, to have some critical component that's missing in order to complete a project or something like that. So if somebody's going to Chile anyway, maybe they can just take a multi-gas instrument or a mini LOAS instrument and make some additional measurements, or take another person with them or something like that to increase the number of data points we get. So that's about what the network is doing right now. We've only been operating for about a year. We have about 82 members from 16 countries, and only 19 of those were from the original Commission of Chemistry of Organic Gases. 50 new people have come into that community that have not really been involved in the community. So we're getting a lot of interesting ideas from people that were not directly involved in that kind of work before. So that's all I have. Thank you for your attention.
I was very interested in this back arc outgassing of CO2. Is there going to be any effort to put in some kind of monitoring for those types of sites? Because that sounds like a very significant component of the outgassing.
Yeah, and these vents that we did not know. We've been working in Costa Rica for a long time, like more than 10 years, and only in very recent times have we been told about these places. And in fact, Puxair is mining the CO2 and selling it. So they have a huge plant that takes out the pure CO2, they do almost nothing to it, and put it on the market to put in Coke and beer and so on. And so there are probably places like that in many, many more countries and in many, many more back arcs. And in East Africa, we found these dry CO2 vents that have lower than ambient temperature, and CO2 is just pouring out of it. And a lot of these are not known. They're not cataloged. They're not published on. So we just kind of start working on these. But yeah, we do want to, first of all, find more of them, and then maybe monitor their emissions over time. I think it's much easier to work on those than on volcanoes because the gases are not that acid and there's no volcanic hazard associated with them. And of course, if you go in the real back arc where Honduras is sampling that, you get CO2 emissions as well from springs that have magmatic mantle signatures. Again, those back arc emissions are not quantified at all at this point. So in addition to the behind the volcanic front, the back arc, the soil degassing of CO2 is very, very poorly quantified compared to what we think comes out of the arcs themselves. So that's certainly an area that needs a lot of improvement.
Is the Deep Carbon Observatory related at all to the ICOS, the International Carbon Observing System?
No, I don't think so. What is that?
I don't know quite as much about that one, but it's one of the partners in this project Copius that we've been working on with the Europeans, and NEON is working partly with them as well. And the counterpart is the ICOS in Europe. And the reason I'm asking is that one of the things we're trying to do is build information technologies that allow cyber infrastructure that connects all these systems. And so one of our use cases is in Iceland. So I noticed you had the big volcano.
Right, right. Yeah, I don't know about that one, but people in the Deep Carbon Observatory might have some connections to that. Yeah, but I would suspect they measure surface carbon emissions probably. So organic carbon, perhaps more than their deep carbon. Yeah, more biological, similar to the NEON project as well. Yeah, that's interesting. And making those connections, I think, is really important because we can really complement each other in terms of where we're measuring, right? Where we're
trying to get all the other, getting all the other data that you want for a particular study.
Right.
So, obviously, when you're trying to study a plume eruption in Iceland, you're going to want to know what the seismology is doing, the GPS, the airbornes, the remote sensing.
Exactly. Yeah, you need to know all of these parameters if you want to make progress.
On one of your last slides, you were listing complementary technologies and data sets, LiDAR and things like that. There's one called Bento Box.
Yes.
What is that?
Oh, the Bento Box. Yeah. Where's lunch? So the bento box is a system that was really developed by Behar, Alberto Behar. So it's an acronym, Behar's measuring something. I'm not sure, but it's a box that takes a lot of different signals from any kinds of sensors. So and then it takes those signals, manipulates these signals, and either stores them or sends them via satellite link to wherever you want them to be. So the bento box, in our case, records currently seismic data from a seismic station on Kilauea volcano and gas data from a gas sensor also on Kilauea volcano. There's also one, I think, at in Iceland, at one of those volcanoes in Iceland, and there are several ones, I think, in Central America. It's not really a measuring system because it uses other sensors, but it's a really nice way of storing the data and sending them off elsewhere. So yeah.